Wells Restaurant, Harlem, July 7, 1968. Bumpy Johnson pushed his plate away, clutched his chest, and collapsed face first onto the table. The most powerful black gangster in American history was dead before the ambulance arrived. Heart attack, the doctor said. Natural causes at age 62. Case closed. But the people who knew Bumpy, the ones who'd watched him survive shootouts, prison riots, and 30 years of mob warfare, they didn't buy it. Because Bumpy Johnson didn't just die that night. He died 2 weeks after threatening to expose the heroin pipeline flooding Harlem. He died 3 days after a heated argument with Italian mob bosses about drug territories. And he died in a restaurant owned by a man with connections to the very people Bumpy had been fighting against. So the question that haunted Harlem for decades wasn't whether Bumpy died. It was whether someone made sure he did. July 1968. America was burning. Martin Luther King had been assassinated 3 months earlier. Cities across the country had erupted in riots. The Black Panther Party was arming itself in Oakland. Malcolm X's followers were still demanding justice for his murder 3 years prior. And in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was watching his kingdom crumble. The Italian mob had broken their promise. The deal Bumpy made with Lucky Luciano back in 1946, the gentleman's agreement that kept Harlem independent, it was dead. And in its place came something far more sinister: heroin. By 1968, heroin was destroying Harlem. Not the numbers racket, not the policy games, not the illegal gambling that Bumpy had controlled for decades. This was different. This was poison in powder form, and it was everywhere. Kids as young as 12 were nodding off in doorways. Mothers were selling their bodies for a fix. Entire families were being wiped out. And Bumpy Johnson, the man who'd built his empire on vice but never on narcotics, was furious. He'd made it clear from the beginning: no drugs in Harlem. Gambling, bootlegging, numbers, fine. Those were victimless crimes, hustles that gave people hope of hitting it big. But heroin? That destroyed communities. That killed futures. And Bumpy had watched it happen to people he grew up with, people he cared about. So when the Italian families, specifically the Genovese crew, started flooding Harlem with heroin in the mid-60s, Bumpy pushed back, hard. He started shutting down drug corners. He had his enforcers run dealers out of the neighborhood. He even went to Frank Costello, his old ally from the Luciano days, and demanded they pull their product out. Costello told him the same thing everyone else did. "This is bigger than you, Bumpy. The money's too good. Walk away." But Bumpy Johnson never walked away from anything in his life. In late June 1968, 2 weeks before he died, Bumpy called a meeting with several Harlem community leaders, local ministers, and a few journalists he trusted. The meeting took place in the back room of Small's Paradise, a legendary Harlem jazz club. And what Bumpy said in that room would become the source of endless speculation after his death. He told them he had names. He told them he had evidence. Shipping routes, police payoffs, political connections, the whole pipeline from Turkey to Marseille to New York. He told them he was ready to go public. One of the ministers who was there, Reverend Calvin Hayes, later recalled Bumpy's exact words: "They think I'm too old to fight back. They think I'll just fade away and let them poison my people. But I've been taking notes for 3 years. I know who's shipping it, who's protecting it, and who's profiting from it. And if they don't stop, I'm going to burn their whole operation to the ground." 3 days later, Bumpy had another meeting. This one wasn't with ministers. It was with Matty the Horse Ianello, a captain in the Genovese crime family. They met at a social club in Little Italy, neutral ground, but the conversation was anything but neutral. According to Tommy Lucchese Jr., who heard about it secondhand, the meeting got heated fast. Bumpy demanded the Genovese family pull their heroin operations out of Harlem. Ianello laughed in his face. "You don't run Harlem anymore, old man. Times have changed." Bumpy allegedly stood up, pointed at Ianello, and said, "I've got enough dirt on your family to put 20 of you in prison for life. Try me." Ianello didn't flinch. "You threatening us, Bumpy? Because that would be a mistake." Bumpy walked out without another word. That was July 4th, 1968, 3 days before he died. July 7th started like any other Sunday for Bumpy Johnson. He woke up in his apartment on Lenox Avenue, had breakfast with his wife Mayme, read the newspaper. He seemed tired, Mayme would later say, but not sick, not weak, just tired.
Around 5 p.m., Bumpy told Mayme he was meeting some associates for dinner at Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street and 7th Avenue. Wells was a Harlem institution, a supper club known for its
fried chicken, live music, and late-night crowd. It was owned by a man named Junie Bird, a Harlem native with a clean reputation. Or so everyone thought. Bumpy arrived at Wells around 6:30 p.m. He wasn't alone. He was with 3 men: Frank Lucas, his protege, Zach Robinson, one of his enforcers, and Sonny Chance, a numbers runner who'd worked for Bumpy for years. They sat at Bumpy's usual table in the back corner, away from the main dining room. Bumpy ordered his regular: fried chicken, collard greens, cornbread, and a glass of water. No alcohol. Bumpy rarely drank. The meal started normal. They talked business, laughed, smoked cigars. But about 40 minutes in, something changed. Frank Lucas, who would later become a drug kingpin himself, remembered the moment clearly. Bumpy stopped talking mid-sentence. He set his fork down, wiped his forehead, and said, "I don't feel right." Lucas asked him what was wrong. Bumpy shook his head. "I don't know. My chest feels tight. Feels like something squeezing my heart." Zach Robinson stood up, ready to call for help, but Bumpy waved him off. "I'm fine. Just need some air." He never got the chance. 30 seconds later, Bumpy grabbed the edge of the table. His face went pale and he collapsed forward, knocking his plate to the floor. His chest hit the table hard. His eyes were open, but he wasn't moving. Frank Lucas screamed for someone to call an ambulance. Sonny Chance tried to lift Bumpy up, but his body was dead weight. Zach Robinson checked for a pulse. Nothing. The restaurant erupted into chaos. People were shouting, crying, running for the door. But by the time the ambulance arrived 15 minutes later, Bumpy Johnson was already gone. The official cause of death, according to the medical examiner's report, was a massive heart attack, acute myocardial infarction. The report noted that Bumpy had a history of heart problems, high blood pressure, and decades of stress. At 62 years old in 1968, dying of a heart attack wasn't unusual. Case closed. Or was it? Within hours of Bumpy's death, rumors started spreading through Harlem like wildfire. He was poisoned. It had to be poison. He was fine that morning. He was healthy enough to walk to the restaurant. How does a man drop dead in 40 minutes? Frank Lucas, who was sitting right next to Bumpy when he died, never publicly said he thought it was poison. But privately, he told people he had his doubts. Bumpy ate the same thing he always ate: fried chicken, greens, cornbread. But that night, something was different. He kept saying the food tasted off. He barely touched his plate. And when Bumpy Johnson, a man who loved food, doesn't eat, something's wrong. Mayme Johnson, Bumpy's widow, was even more direct. She told anyone who would listen that her husband was murdered. She pointed to 3 things. First, Bumpy had just threatened to expose the Italian mob's heroin operation. That alone was a death sentence. Second, he died in a restaurant owned by Junie Bird, a man who Mayme claimed had secret ties to organized crime. Third, there was no autopsy, no toxicology report, no investigation. The city medical examiner ruled it a heart attack and closed the case in less than 24 hours. For a man as powerful and controversial as Bumpy Johnson, that was suspicious. Mayme demanded an independent autopsy. The city refused. She hired a lawyer to push for an investigation. The lawyer was told there was no evidence of foul play. She went to the NYPD. They told her the case was closed. Mayme Johnson spent the rest of her life believing her husband was poisoned and that the people responsible were protected by the same system Bumpy had fought against his entire life. So what actually happened? Let's look at the evidence. On one hand, Bumpy Johnson was 62 years old in 1968. He'd been shot multiple times over his life. He'd survived beatings, stabbings, and 10 years in some of the hardest prisons in America, including Alcatraz. That kind of life takes a toll on the body. High blood pressure, heart disease, chronic stress, all of that made him a prime candidate for a heart attack. The medical examiner's report wasn't fabricated. Bumpy had documented heart issues. His doctor had warned him to slow down, to reduce stress, to take better care of himself. But Bumpy ignored all of it. He kept working, kept fighting, kept pushing. So on paper, dying of a heart attack made perfect sense. But on the other hand, the timing was almost too convenient. Bumpy dies 2 weeks after threatening to expose the mob's heroin pipeline. He dies 3 days after a confrontation with the Genovese captain. He dies in a restaurant with mob connections. And the city closes the case in less than a day without a toxicology screen. That's not normal. Even in 1968, when forensic science wasn't as advanced, suspicious deaths of high-profile figures usually warranted at least a basic investigation. But Bumpy's death? Nothing. No follow-up. No questions. Just a death certificate and a closed case. And then there's the poison theory itself. In 1968, There were several substances that could cause a heart attack and leave almost no trace. Potassium chloride, for example, when injected or ingested in high doses, stops the heart almost immediately. It's naturally found in the body, so unless you're specifically looking for abnormal levels, it won't show up in a standard autopsy. Digitalis, a heart medication, in high doses can cause cardiac arrest. Again, it metabolizes quickly and would be nearly impossible to detect without a targeted toxicology screen. And then there's the mafia's favorite, strychnine, mixed with something to mask the taste. Causes violent muscle spasms that can mimic a heart attack. If someone wanted Bumpy dead and wanted it to look natural, they had options. Frank Lucas, years later, would hint at what he suspected. In an interview in the 1990s, he said, "Bumpy was careful. He didn't trust easy. But that night, he let his guard down. He was with people he knew. He was in his neighborhood. He thought he was safe. And that's when they got him." Lucas never named names. He never provided proof. But he also never stopped believing that Bumpy Johnson was murdered. So who would have wanted Bumpy dead? The list is long. The Genovese crime family had the most obvious motive. Bumpy was threatening their heroin empire. He had evidence that could bring down their entire operation. He was a liability, and the mob had a long history of eliminating liabilities. But there's another angle. Bumpy's own protege, Frank Lucas, stood to gain the most from Bumpy's death. With Bumpy gone, Frank took over Harlem's underworld. He built his own heroin empire, the same empire Bumpy had spent years trying to prevent. Frank always denied having anything to do with Bumpy's death. He called Bumpy a father figure, a mentor, the man who taught him everything. But in the world of organized crime, loyalty only goes so far. And when millions of dollars are on the line, even father figures become expendable. Then there's the political angle. By 1968, the FBI had Bumpy Johnson under surveillance. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI had been targeting black organized crime figures for years, and Bumpy was at the top of the list. Some conspiracy theorists believe the government had a hand in Bumpy's death, either directly or by looking the other way when the mob made their move. There's no hard evidence for this, but given the FBI's track record of illegal surveillance, harassment, and even assassination of black leaders during that era, it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. The truth is, we'll probably never know for sure what killed Bumpy Johnson. Was it a heart attack brought on by decades of stress and violence? Possibly. Was it poison slipped into his food by someone he trusted? Also possible. Was it a coordinated hit by the Italian mob, Frank Lucas, or even the government? We can't rule it out. What we do know is this. Bumpy Johnson died at the most convenient time for his enemies, and the most devastating time for Harlem. Within months of his death, heroin had completely taken over the neighborhood. Frank Lucas became the king of Harlem's drug trade. The Italian families consolidated their power. And the code Bumpy had lived by, no drugs in Harlem, died with him. Bumpy Johnson's funeral was held on July 12, 1968, at the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem. Over 1,000 people showed up. Ministers, politicians, jazz musicians, hustlers, working-class families. They all came to pay their respects to the man who'd been Harlem's protector, its enforcer, its king. But as the casket was carried out of the church, one question hung in the air. Did Bumpy Johnson die, or was he silenced? If this story of mystery, power, and the unsolved death of a legend made you think, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Share this with someone who loves true crime and untold history, and let me know in the comments, do you think Bumpy was poisoned, or did his heart just give out? Drop your theory below. Keep searching for the truth, and I'll see you in the next one.